The sun rose over the black soil of Kemet with the same relentless precision that governed every aspect of life along the river, and in the 3rd year of the reign of Pharaoh Khufu, a young scribe named Hemiunu stood at the edge of what would become the greatest construction project the world had ever witnessed, unaware that his calculations would be studied for millennia by minds he could never imagine. The year was approximately 2550 BCE, by a calendar system that would not exist for thousands of years, and Hemiunu held in his hands papyrus sheets covered with numerical notations that represented not merely measurements, but the very will of a god made flesh. For Khufu was not simply a king, but the living embodiment of Horus, son of Ra, and his eternal resting place could not be conceived in terms familiar to common mortals. The young architect had been trained since childhood in the House of Life attached to the temple complex at Memphis, where the secrets of geometry were guarded as jealously as the rituals that ensured the sun's daily rebirth, and he had learned to calculate volumes using a sophisticated understanding of mathematics that included fractions expressed in ways that would seem alien to those who came after. The Egyptian system of expressing fractions almost exclusively as unit fractions, where every fraction was represented as a sum of fractions with numerator 1, required a mental flexibility that transformed the act of calculation into something approaching meditation, each problem a puzzle that connected the mathematician to the underlying order of Ma'at, the cosmic principle of truth and balance that held chaos at bay. Hemiunu's father had served under Pharaoh Sneferu, Khufu's father, and had witnessed the evolution of pyramid construction through 3 massive experiments that had taught the royal architects lessons written in thousands of tons of limestone and the sweat of countless workers. Sneferu's first pyramid at Medum had begun as a step pyramid and been converted to a true pyramid, but the outer casing had eventually collapsed, creating a tower rising from a hill of rubble that stood as a monument to ambition outpacing technique. The bent pyramid at Dashur had forced a dramatic change in angle halfway through construction, when the architects realized their initial slope was creating dangerous internal stresses, and this adjustment, visible to anyone who looked upon it, represented not failure but the wisdom to adapt, a quality the Egyptians valued above stubborn adherence to initial plans. The Red Pyramid, also at Dashur, had finally achieved what Sneferu sought, a true pyramid with smooth sides rising at a safe angle to a perfect point, its red limestone blocks fitted with such precision that the seams between them could barely accommodate a knife blade. These 3 pyramids had consumed more stone than Khufu's Great Pyramid would require, making Sneferu the greatest builder in terms of sheer volume. Yet it was Khufu's monument that would refine and perfect the form, rising to a height of 280 cubits, each cubit measured as the length from a man's elbow to the tip of his middle finger, approximately 52.4 centimeters in the measurements that would eventually replace this human-scaled unit. The workforce that gathered at Giza during the inundation season, when the Nile's floods made agricultural work impossible, was not the slave army of popular imagination, but a constantly rotating labour force of Egyptian farmers fulfilling their obligations to the state, their service a form of taxation that bound them to the divine order and allowed them to participate directly in the most sacred project of their generation. These men lived in a workers' village whose remains would not be discovered until the 1980s, revealing details of daily life that shattered romantic notions of oppression and suffering. The workers received wages in the form of bread and beer, with a single labourer consuming approximately 10 loaves and a portion of beer daily, the beer providing not intoxication, but essential calories and nutrients, its thick, soupy consistency making it more food than beverage. The bakeries that supported the pyramid construction operated on an industrial scale, with archaeological evidence suggesting a production capacity that could feed thousands of workers simultaneously, the grain flowing from state storehouses that collected agricultural surplus during the abundant harvest seasons. The workers were organised into competing crews with names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure, these designations appearing as graffiti marks on the stones themselves, written in red ochre by men who took pride in their blocks, signing their work as any craftsman might, leaving messages across the centuries that spoke of rivalry, humour and human personality in an endeavour often imagined as grimly mechanical. The limestone blocks that formed the pyramid's core were quarried from the Giza plateau itself, the pharaoh's monument rising from a massive hole that would later be incorporated into the surrounding temple complex. Every cubic cubit of stone removed from the earth and lifted toward the sky, representing a transformation of matter that paralleled the spiritual transformation Khufu would undergo in death. The finer white limestone that would eventually case the pyramid in a smooth gleaming surface came from quarries at Tura, across the Nile, where workmen cut blocks from underground galleries, following veins of superior stone into the earth, their copper chisels and wooden wedges separating blocks along natural fracture lines, with an efficiency born of generations of accumulated knowledge. The granite used for the king's chamber and the massive beams above it came from Aswan, 600 miles to the south, each block weighing as much as 50 tons, transported during the inundation when the Nile rose high enough to allow boats to approach close to the construction site. The river transformed annually into a highway that united Upper and Lower Egypt in a circulatory system of commerce and communication. The logistics of this transportation network required planning that extended years into the future, with quarry workers at Aswan beginning to cut blocks that would not reach Giza until subsequent inundations. The entire kingdom synchronized to the rhythm of construction, its resources bent toward the single purpose of ensuring Khufu's successful transition to the afterlife. The internal chambers of the Great Pyramid represented an architectural puzzle that would perplex explorers for millennia, with 3 separate chambers suggesting changes in plan or perhaps deliberate misdirection to protect the pharaoh's burial from the tomb robbers who plagued even the most secure royal sepulchres. The lowest chamber was cut into the bedrock beneath the pyramid, its rough walls and unfinished floor suggesting abandonment, though some scholars would later argue it was always intended as a symbolic gesture, a connection to the underworld through which the pharaoh must pass. The second chamber, misleadingly called the Queen's Chamber by medieval explorers, despite having no connection to any queen, sat at the pyramid's heart, its peaked ceiling and peculiar air shafts that did not quite penetrate to the exterior, creating mysteries that would generate endless speculation. The grand gallery that ascended toward the king's chamber was an architectural marvel whose purpose remained obscure, its corbelled ceiling rising 28 feet high, in a narrow passage whose walls seemed to press inward, creating a space that was simultaneously monumental and claustrophobic, its purpose perhaps ceremonial, perhaps structural, or perhaps both in ways that Egyptian thinking did not separate. The king's chamber itself was a masterpiece of granite construction, its 5 relieving chambers above distributing the weight of millions of tons of stone so that the burial chamber remained intact. The ancient engineers understanding principles of load distribution that would not be formally articulated until thousands of years later. Within the king's chamber sat a granite sarcophagus that had been installed during construction, its dimensions slightly larger than the entrance passage, proving it had been positioned before the chamber was completed, and this sarcophagus, empty when the pyramid was first entered in the 9th century CE, represented the destination of all this effort, the vessel in which Khufu's mummified body would rest, surrounded by the grave goods necessary for his journey through the Duat, the dangerous realm of the dead where he would face challenges and judgments before achieving resurrection among the stars. The ancient Egyptians did not conceive of the afterlife as a vague spiritual realm, but as a specific geography requiring navigation, provisioning, and magical protection, the deceased needing to know the names of gates and guardians, to recite the correct formulae, to present evidence of a life lived in accordance with Ma'at, the Book of the Dead, though it would not be compiled in its familiar form until the New Kingdom more than 1,000 years after Khufu's reign, represented the culmination of beliefs already ancient in Khufu's time, the pyramid itself functioning as both protection and launch pad, its form perhaps representing the primordial mound that emerged from the waters of chaos at creation, or perhaps the rays of the sun made solid, or perhaps both simultaneously in the typically Egyptian manner of embracing multiple truths. The priests who served the pyramid temple after Khufu's death formed a permanent establishment, supported by endowments of agricultural land, their duties including daily offerings of bread, beer, meat, and incense. The K, or spiritual double of the deceased pharaoh, requiring sustenance just as the living body had, this feeding of the dead representing not superstition, but a sophisticated understanding of memory and presence. The continued performance of rituals keeping Khufu alive in ways that transcended physical existence. These mortuary cults could persist for centuries, with some pyramid temples receiving offerings hundreds of years after the pharaoh's death. The endowments occasionally renewed by later rulers seeking to associate themselves with the glory of the Old Kingdom, though eventually economic pressures and political changes would cause most to lapse, the priests dispersing, the temples falling silent, the bread no longer baked, the beer no longer poured. The pyramid itself, however, remained, its mass too great to dismantle entirely, though later generations would strip away the fine limestone casing to build medieval Cairo, revealing the stepped core that gives the pyramid its current appearance, each missing casing stone representing a small victory of practicality over preservation. The city of the living literally built from the monuments of the dead. But in the years when the pyramid was new, when its smooth white sides blazed in the sun like a geometric mountain crowned with a gilded capstone called a pyramidion, this structure dominated the landscape in ways difficult to imagine from the weathered monument that survives, and the people who saw it knew they were looking at something unprecedented, a building that redefined what human organization could achieve, The society that created such monuments was itself a wonder, organized along principles that had evolved over centuries of agricultural surplus and centralized control. The predictable flooding of the Nile creating conditions that rewarded planning and cooperation. The entire kingdom functioning as an enormous machine for transforming grain into monuments, art, military power, and the elaborate rituals that maintained the cosmic order. The pharaoh stood at the apex of this system, not merely as a political ruler but as the central link between human and divine realms, his person so sacred that those who approached him performed elaborate prostrations, and his daily routine was structured by rituals that ensured the continuation of fundamental cosmic processes. The pharaoh's morning toilet recapitulating the sun god's emergence from darkness, his meals offerings to the divine resident in the royal body. Below the pharaoh stood the vizier, the Shiati, whose position Hemiunu himself would eventually hold, responsible for the day-to-day administration of the kingdom, overseeing tax collection, judicial proceedings, public works, and the complex bureaucracy that kept records of every transaction, every field, every head of cattle. This obsessive accounting creating an archive that would allow future historians to reconstruct Egyptian society in extraordinary detail, though the vast majority of these papyri would eventually be lost, burned, composted, or simply dissolved by time and moisture. The scribes who maintained these records occupied a privileged position in Egyptian society, their literacy separating them from the vast majority of the population and opening paths to advancement unavailable to even prosperous farmers. And Egyptian literature preserved numerous texts praising the scribe's profession, contrasting its comfort with the hardships of soldiers, farmers and craftsmen, these texts revealing class attitudes with remarkable frankness. One such text described the farmer's life as an endless litany of suffering, assailed by taxes and pests and floods, while another catalogued the miseries of various professions in language meant to convince students that mastering the difficult hieratic script was worthwhile, despite the years of discipline required. The writing system itself existed in multiple forms simultaneously, with monumental hieroglyphs used for religious texts and formal inscriptions, hieratic script employed for administrative documents and literary works, and eventually demotic emerging as a simplified cursive form for everyday transactions, each system serving different functions in a society that understood the power of written language to transcend time and space, to make absent things present, to bind the future to patterns established in the mythological past. The hieroglyphic system combined logographic signs representing whole words with phonetic signs representing sounds, along with determinatives that clarified meaning, creating a writing system of extraordinary flexibility and aesthetic appeal but considerable complexity. The several hundred signs in common use requiring years to master, and the additional hundreds of rarely used signs accessible only to the most learned scribes. The ability to read the ancient inscriptions was lost after the closing of the last pagan temples in the late Roman period, and hieroglyphs became mysterious symbols whose meaning was the subject of wild speculation until Jean-François Champollion, working with the Rosetta Stone, finally cracked the code in 1822, opening Egyptian civilization to modern scholarship and revealing the voices of people dead for millennia. Those voices spoke of concerns both familiar and alien, revealing a people who worried about family, employment, and social standing, who fell in love and grieved their losses, who enjoyed parties and complained about taxes, but who also inhabited a mental universe where gods walked among mortals, where magic was technology, where words spoken correctly could alter reality, and where death was not an ending but a transformation requiring elaborate preparation. The mummification process that preserved bodies for the afterlife was a closely guarded priestly secret in the Old Kingdom, though by later periods it had become a commercial industry, with varying levels of quality available at different price points. The most elaborate procedure requiring 70 days and involving the removal of internal organs through carefully placed incisions, the brain extracted through the nostrils with long hooks, the body cavity packed with natron, salt, and aromatic substances, the entire corpse eventually wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen strips, each stage accompanied by spells and rituals that transformed the deceased into a say, a spiritual body capable of housing the returning soul. The canopic jars that held the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were protected by the 4 sons of Horus, each jar presided over by a different deity, while the heart, considered the seat of intelligence and motion, remained in the body where it would be weighed in the afterlife against the feather of Ma'at. This judgment scene depicted countless times in tomb paintings and papyri, the heart that proved heavier than the feather devoured by Amit, a chimeric demon who was part crocodile, part leopard, part hippopotamus, the 3 most dangerous animals known to the Egyptians combined into the ultimate destroyer. The tombs surrounding the pyramids at Giza belonged to members of the royal family and high officials, their mastaba tombs arranged in neat rows like streets in a city of the dead. And these tombs preserved on their walls scenes of daily life rendered in low relief with such skill and attention to detail that they serve as windows into a vanished world. The tomb of Ti, a wealthy official, shows workers engaged in every imaginable activity. Farmers ploughing fields behind teams of oxen, fishermen hauling nets bulging with fish, butchers slaughtering cattle, bakers kneading dough, brewers straining beer, carpenters sawing planks, goldsmiths weighing precious metal, scribes recording transactions, and servants carrying offerings toward the false door through which Ti's car would emerge to receive sustenance. These scenes were not mere decoration but functioned magically, the depicted activities occurring eternally in the afterlife, providing the tomb owner with endless supplies of food, drink, and service. The images activated by the proper rituals and the speaking of the names and titles of the deceased. For to speak a person's name was to make them live, and the most terrible curse was to have one's name erased, one's memory obliterated, to die the second death from which there was no return. The artistic conventions that governed these tomb scenes had been established early in Egyptian history and would persist for 3,000 years with remarkably little change. Human figures rendered with heads in profile but eyes frontal, torsos frontal but legs in profile. This composite view, presenting the most characteristic and recognizable aspects of the body, rather than mimicking optical reality, a conceptual rather than perceptual approach to representation that extended to all aspects of Egyptian art. Sizes of figures were determined by social importance rather than spatial relationships, the tomb owner appearing largest, his wife and children smaller, servants and workers smaller still. this hierarchical scaling making social relationships immediately legible. The registers in which scenes were arranged stacked vertically on the wall, each register representing a separate space rather than objects at different distances, and the lack of perspective in the Greek or Renaissance sense did not indicate primitive technique, but reflected different priorities, a different understanding of what images should accomplish. Colour in these reliefs followed conventional rather than naturalistic rules. Men typically painted red-brown to indicate their lives spent labouring outdoors. Women painted pale yellow to show their more sheltered existence. The colour palette limited by available minerals and organic materials to blacks from soot and charcoal, whites from chalk and gypsum, reds and yellows from iron oxides, blues from copper compounds, and later from synthesized Egyptian blue, one of the first artificial pigments, greens from malachite. These colours retaining their vibrancy in sealed tombs for thousands of years, only fading when exposed to light and moisture after excavation. The objects placed in tombs reveal the material culture of ancient Egypt in extraordinary detail. The dry climate and the practice of burial preserving organic materials that rarely survive elsewhere. And from these tombs have emerged furniture of sophisticated design and construction, jewellery demonstrating technical mastery of metalworking and stone cutting, cosmetic implements including mirrors of polished copper, coal tubes for the black eye paint both men and women wore, razors indicating that Egyptian men typically went clean-shaven, linen clothing so fine it was nearly transparent, wigs of human hair or plant fibre arranged in elaborate styles, board games including Senet which had religious significance related to the journey through the afterlife, musical instruments including harps, flutes and drums, weapons of war including composite bows, copper-headed arrows, bronze daggers and axes, model boats complete with crews and supplies, model granaries with removable roofs revealing tiny grain stores, model workshops showing miniature workers engaged in butchery, brewing, weaving and other crafts. These models magically providing the deceased with the products and services depicted. The tomb of Tutankhamun, discovered nearly intact in 1922, revealed the staggering wealth invested in royal burials, his tomb filled with thousands of objects including 4 nested coffins, the innermost of solid gold, a gold funerary mask that has become the iconic image of ancient Egypt, thrones and beds overlaid with gold, chests containing clothing and sandals, weapons including boomerangs and staffs, chariots disassembled for burial, preserved food including wine, grain, honey and haunches of meat, and countless amulets and ritual objects designed to protect and assist the king in the afterlife. And this was for a relatively minor pharaoh who died young. His tomb hastily prepared and probably originally intended for someone else, suggesting that the great pharaohs of earlier periods must have been buried with wealth almost beyond imagination, all of which was eventually stolen by tomb robbers who began plundering royal graves within generations of burial. The treasures melted down, scattered and lost. The tomb robbery that plagued ancient Egypt was not merely a criminal enterprise, but approached the status of an industry, with professional thieves, corrupt officials, and even priests involved in systematic looting of the necropolis, and papyri from the New Kingdom preserve records of tomb robbery trials in which the accused describe their crimes in remarkable detail. Confessions extracted through beatings administered with pium ribs and twisted ropes. These documents revealing that tombs were often robbed within decades of burial, the robbers sometimes burning the wooden coffins to provide light while they stripped the mummies of their jewellery, scattering the dismembered bodies in their search for amulets sewn into the wrappings or placed within the body cavities. The violation of the royal mummies eventually became so severe that priests in the Third Intermediate Period gathered the surviving bodies of the great pharaohs of the New Kingdom and hid them in two caches, one in a cliff tomb at Deir el-Bahari and another in the tomb of Amenhotep Senter in the Valley of the Kings, where they remained concealed until their discovery in the late 19th century. The Deir el-Bahari cache discovered by the local Abd el-Rasul family, who kept it secret for years, selling off objects piecemeal before the authorities finally forced them to reveal the source, and when Egyptologists entered the tomb they found themselves face to face with the greatest pharaohs of Egypt's imperial age, Ahmosis I, who expelled the Hyksos, the three Tuthmose kings, Seti Theas and Rameses II, their mummies tagged with hieratic labels identifying them, these bodies that had ruled an empire now reduced to desiccated bundles of bone and blackened skin, yet still recognizable as individuals. Rameses II's hooked nose and jutting jaw still conveying an impression of imperious authority. But in the Old Kingdom, when Khufu ruled, tomb robbery had not yet become the plague it would later represent, and the builders of the Great Pyramid genuinely believed they were constructing an eternal resting place that would protect the pharaoh's body throughout eternity. Their confidence justified by the sheer mass of stone they were manipulating, the internal plugs and seals and false passages they incorporated, the architectural secrets they guarded. The construction techniques they employed have been debated endlessly, with no definitive consensus on exactly how blocks weighing several tons each were raised to heights exceeding 400 feet. The most plausible theories involving ramps that were extended and raised as the pyramid grew, these ramps perhaps spiraling around the pyramid, or perhaps constructed as a single, long straight ramp, or perhaps a combination of approaches, the ramps themselves requiring enormous quantities of material and representing a construction challenge comparable to the pyramid itself. And whatever form they took, they were completely removed after construction, leaving no trace, the Egyptians preferring their monuments to appear as finished objects that had somehow always existed rather than revealing the processes of their creation. The tools available to the pyramid builders were simple by modern standards: copper chisels and saws for cutting limestone, harder stones like dolerite used as pounders to dress granite, wooden sledges to transport blocks, ropes of papyrus fibre or flax to pull the sledges, wooden rollers or perhaps simply wet sand to reduce friction, copper or bronze tools hardened through cold working and frequent resharpening, the absence of iron and steel requiring techniques that maximize the effectiveness of available materials, and experiments have demonstrated that ancient methods could indeed accomplish what the finished monuments prove they accomplished. Though the physical effort required was enormous, each block representing hours or days of labour depending on its size and hardness. The organisation required to coordinate this labour was perhaps more impressive than the physical techniques, the administrators ensuring that the right materials arrived at the right locations at the right times, that workers were fed and housed and supervised, that quality was maintained, that the astronomical alignments were accurate, the Great Pyramid oriented to true north, with an error of only a few arc minutes. This precision achieved without magnetic compasses through careful observation of stars, probably circumpolar stars that never set. Their circular path around the celestial pole mapped to establish true north. The Egyptians were keen observers of the heavens. Their agricultural calendar, based on the annual heliacal rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, which reappeared in the pre-dawn sky each year just before the Nile's flood. This coincidence of stellar and terrestrial cycles seeming to confirm the fundamental order of the universe, and they divided the sky into constellations that differed from Mesopotamian and later Greek systems, their decanal stars marking the hours of the night, 36 decans each rising heliacally 10 days apart. Though the system was complicated by the fact that stellar and solar years are not identical, requiring periodic adjustments. The Egyptian calendar year consisted of 12 30-day months, divided into 3 seasons of 4 months each: Akhet the inundation, Pere the growing season, and Shemu the harvest, with 5 extra days added at the year's end. These epigomenal days considered dangerous times when the barrier between the ordered world and chaos thinned, and because the calendar year of 365 days was slightly shorter than the solar year, the calendar slowly drifted relative to the seasons, completing a full cycle every 460 years in what is called a Sothic cycle. Though this drift was not seen as a problem requiring correction, but as part of the natural order. The Nile itself was the foundation of all Egyptian civilization, its predictable annual flood depositing rich silt that renewed the soil's fertility without requiring the crop rotation or fallowing that agriculture in less favoured regions demanded. And this agricultural abundance produced the surplus that fed the armies of workers, paid for the monuments, supported the bureaucracy, and funded the temple establishments that grew increasingly wealthy over the centuries. The flood arrived each year in midsummer, the water level rising gradually until it overflowed the banks and spread across the floodplain, remaining high for several months before receding in autumn to reveal the renewed soil ready for planting. And the Egyptians measured the flood's height with nilometers, architectural devices consisting of marked stairs or columns against which the water level could be read. These measurements crucial for predicting the year's agricultural yield, and thus for setting tax rates. A high flood promising abundance but potentially destroying villages too close to the river. A low flood threatening famine. The irrigation systems that extended the reach of the flood consisted primarily of basins surrounded by earthen banks. These basins filled during the inundation, and the water held on the land for weeks, allowing the silt to settle before the water was drained off and crops planted in the enriched mud, a system called basin irrigation that remained essentially unchanged for thousands of years until the construction of modern dams fundamentally altered the Nile's behaviour. The crops grown in this rich soil included emmer wheat and barley as staples, flax for linen production, papyrus harvested from wetlands and processed into writing material by cutting the pith into strips, laying them perpendicular in 2 layers, and pounding them together until the plant's natural juices created a bond, producing sheets that could be joined into rolls 20 feet or longer, this paper-like material giving us the word paper through its Greek name papyrus. The diet of ancient Egyptians depended on social class, with bread and beer the foundation for everyone, supplemented by onions, garlic, leeks, cucumbers, lettuce, lentils, chickpeas, and dates for common people, while the wealthy enjoyed meat from cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, ducks, and geese. Fish from the Nile, both fresh and dried. Honey as the only available sweetener. Wine made from grapes grown in the delta and imported from the Levant, and exotic imports from trading expeditions to Punt, a land somewhere on the Red Sea coast of Africa or Arabia, whose exact location remains debated. These expeditions returning with myrrh and frankincense, ebony and ivory, exotic animals including baboons and leopards, and gold from Nubia to the south, Egypt's most reliable source of the precious metal that gave the land its ancient name Nubt, the Golden Land. Trade networks extended in every direction from Egypt north to the Levantine coast, where Egyptian influence competed with Mesopotamian and later Hittite and Mitanni power, west into Libya, where Egyptian authority was contested by desert tribes, south into Nubia, which Egypt periodically conquered and colonized, establishing fortresses and trading posts, extracting resources and manpower, and east across the Red Sea and down to Punt, these expeditions requiring overland transport of disassembled ships across the desert from the Nile to the Red Sea coast. The ships then reassembled and sailed south, returning months later with precious cargo that justified the enormous expense and risk. The military power that protected these trade routes and expanded Egyptian territory was based on infantry, armed with spears, axes, and bows, later supplemented by chariots adopted from the Hyksos invaders who ruled northern Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period. These horse-drawn platforms carrying an archer and a driver, transforming Egyptian warfare and creating a new military aristocracy. The professional soldiers were supplemented by conscripted farmers during campaigns, the army functioning as an extension of the state bureaucracy, with the same hierarchical organization, detailed record-keeping, and systematic provisioning, and successful military commanders could rise to positions of great power and wealth, some eventually seizing the throne itself during periods of political fragmentation. The wars Egypt fought were both defensive, protecting the Nile Valley from invasion and raiding, and offensive, expanding into adjacent territories, extracting tribute, capturing slaves, and securing access to resources unavailable in Egypt itself, particularly timber from Lebanon. The cedars of Lebanon mentioned repeatedly in Egyptian texts as the source of wood for ships, flagpoles for temple entrances, and coffins for the wealthy. Egypt's own trees consisting mainly of date palms, acacias, and sycamore figs, none of which produced timber suitable for large construction projects. The temples that consumed such resources were not houses of worship in their modern sense, but were understood as the literal dwelling places of gods. The temple itself, the god's house where priests attended to the deity's needs, much as servants attended to a noble, waking the god each morning with hymns, washing and dressing the cult statue, offering meals of bread, beer, meat, and wine, burning incense, and performing rituals according to a sacred calendar that structured time according to religious festivals and astronomical events. The daily temple service was performed by rotation priests called Wab, meaning pure, who served 1 month in every 4, spending their temple month in a state of ritual purity that required shaving the entire body, washing multiple times daily in the temple's sacred lake, abstaining from sexual activity, and wearing only linen clothing. no wool or leather permitted within the temple precincts, these restrictions distinguishing sacred space and time from the ordinary world. The high priest called Hemiunu, servant of the god, oversaw the temple establishment, controlled its enormous endowments of land and workers, and had access to the innermost sanctuary where the cult statue resided in darkness, broken only when the shrine was opened for the daily ritual. The god considered to be genuinely present in the statue through a ceremony called the opening of the mouth. This ritual performed on statues and also on mummies to restore the ability to breathe, eat, see and hear. The ceremony involving touching the statue or mummy with ritual implements including an adze shaped like the Big Dipper constellation, while reciting spells that animated the inanimate. The gods themselves numbered in the hundreds, ranging from great cosmic deities worshipped throughout Egypt to local gods of particular cities or even specific locations, and the relationships among gods were complex and fluid, with deities merging through syncretism, appearing in different forms in different contexts, and relating to each other through family connections that could vary depending on local tradition. The sun god travelled across the sky in his solar bark during the day and through the dangerous underworld at night, battling the chaos serpent Apophis who sought to swallow him, this daily cycle of death and rebirth, mirroring the pharaoh's hoped-for resurrection, and the annual cycle of the Nile's flood and recession, death and renewal, order and chaos in eternal conflict requiring constant ritual reinforcement of Ma'at. Osiris, murdered by his brother Set and dismembered, was reassembled by his wife Isis and sister Nephthys, mummified and resurrected to rule the underworld, his story providing the mythological template for the mummification and resurrection of every Egyptian, and his son Horus, conceived posthumously through Isis's magic, battled Set to avenge his father and claim kingship. The living pharaoh identified with Horus and the dead pharaoh with Osiris in a cycle of royal succession that connected each pharaoh to every pharaoh before him in an unbroken chain extending back to the first king, Menes or Narmer, who united Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BCE. This unification commemorated on the Narmer palette, which shows the king wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt on one side and the red crown of Lower Egypt on the other, his victory over the northern kingdom depicted through typical Egyptian conventions, showing the king as gigantic and his enemies as tiny and defeated. The political unification that Narmer achieved was never entirely secure, with Egypt periodically fragmenting during the intermediate periods when central authority collapsed. Local governors called nomarchs asserted independence, and rival dynasties competed for legitimacy. These periods of disunion characterized by civil war, economic decline, and in the worst cases famine, when the maintenance of irrigation systems lapsed and the coordinated distribution of resources failed. The first intermediate period following the Old Kingdom saw the Pyramid Age end, the great building projects abandoned, royal authority diminished to the point that the pharaoh controlled little more than the area immediately around Memphis, and tombs from this period show cruder workmanship and smaller scale, reflecting reduced resources and disrupted artistic traditions, but also show the democratization of afterlife beliefs, with spells and privileges previously reserved for royalty becoming accessible to provincial officials. This so-called democratization of the afterlife continuing through subsequent periods, until even ordinary people could aspire to resurrection through proper burial and knowledge of the necessary spells. The Middle Kingdom that eventually emerged from this fragmentation represented a cultural renaissance, with literature flourishing, producing works like The Tale of Sinew, an adventure story about an official who flees Egypt after the assassination of Amenemhat, lives for years among Asiatics in the Levant, achieves success and status, but longs always for Egypt and finally returns to be buried in his homeland. This story, exploring themes of identity, exile, and belonging, while providing detailed descriptions of foreign lands and peoples that reveal Egyptian attitudes toward the uncivilized world beyond their borders, a world they generally viewed with contempt and fear, seeing themselves as the only truly civilized people, surrounded by chaos that they must hold at bay through the strength of Pharaoh and the efficacy of their rituals. The borders of Egypt were marked by fortresses, particularly along the southern frontier with Nubia, where massive mud brick fortresses commanded strategic points along the Nile. These structures incorporating sophisticated defensive features, including ditches, multiple walls, bastions, and covered stairways down to the river, ensuring water supply during siege, and inscriptions from these fortresses reveal the daily routine of garrison soldiers, the patrol schedules, the beacon system that communicated along the chain of forts, and the contempt Egyptian soldiers felt for the Nubians they were stationed to control. Though those same Nubians were valued as mercenary soldiers serving in Egyptian armies, particularly the famed Medjay, who functioned as desert scouts and police. The relationship between Egypt and Nubia was complex and changed over time, with Egypt dominating during strong periods and extracting resources through direct control or tribute, but Nubia asserting independence during Egyptian weakness, and eventually during the Third Intermediate Period, Nubian kings conquered Egypt itself and ruled as the 25th dynasty. These Nubian pharaohs, paradoxically more devoted to traditional Egyptian culture than the Egyptians themselves had recently been, reviving Old Kingdom artistic styles and building pyramids in Sudan. These Nubian pyramids, smaller and steeper than their Egyptian prototypes, but clearly part of the same cultural tradition, demonstrating how thoroughly Nubia had absorbed Egyptian civilization even while maintaining distinct identity. The tools of cultural influence extended beyond military conquest to include the prestige of Egyptian goods, the appeal of Egyptian luxury products and artistic styles, and the utility of hieroglyphic writing, which was adopted by Nubian elites even when writing their own languages, and Egyptian temples built in conquered territories served as centers of Egyptian culture, staffed by Egyptian priests conducting rituals in Egyptian, radiating cultural influence that could outlast political control. The soft power that Egyptian civilization exercised in the ancient world was considerable, with neighbors adopting Egyptian fashions, importing Egyptian products, and respecting Egyptian learning, particularly in areas of medicine and magic which were not distinguished in Egyptian thought, both being technologies for manipulating reality through knowledge of hidden connections and the power of words. Egyptian medical papyri preserved treatments for injuries and diseases, showing empirical observation and practical knowledge alongside magical spells and amulets. The Edwin Smith Papyrus describing 48 cases of injuries, mostly to the head and torso, each case analysed with remarkable clinical precision. describing symptoms, offering a diagnosis, and proposing treatment or acknowledging when a condition was untreatable. The text distinguished by its rational approach and anatomical knowledge, though even this most scientific of Egyptian medical texts includes magical spells for certain conditions. Other medical papiryui focus more heavily on prescriptions and remedies involving complex combinations of plant, mineral, and animal substances, many of which have proven pharmacologically active, while others were purely magical, like the prescription of crocodile dung as a contraceptive, which probably worked, if at all, through functioning as a physical barrier rather than through any property of the dung itself. Magic in ancient Egypt was called Heka and was understood as a natural force pervading the universe, accessible through knowledge and ritual, and magicians were respected professionals whose services were sought for protection, healing, ensuring success in love or business, cursing enemies and communicating with the dead. Their spells written on papyrus or inscribed on amulets, bowls, figurines, and walls. The words themselves considered to have power independent of their meaning, the sound and the written form both efficacious, and knowing the true name of a god or demon gave power over that entity. Hence, the proliferation of secret names and epithets, the true name never spoken, always hidden, protected. The concept of sympathetic magic pervaded Egyptian practice, the idea that like affects like, so that a wax figurine of an enemy could be cursed or burned to harm the actual person, or that wearing an amulet shaped like a particular organ would protect that organ. The heart scarab placed on the mummy's chest, ensuring the art would not testify against the deceased during judgment. The spell inscribed on the scarab's base commanding the heart to remain silent. The deceased themselves could be dangerous, and some tombs include curses threatening anyone who disturbed the burial, though these curses were rarer than popular culture suggests, most tomb owners relying on physical security rather than supernatural threats, and the curse of the pharaohs that supposedly killed members of the expedition that discovered Tutankhamun's tomb was a media invention. Most of the expedition members living normal lifespans, though the death of Lord Carnarvon shortly after the tomb's opening provided just enough coincidence to feed speculation. The tombs themselves evolved over Egyptian history, the mastaba tombs of the Old Kingdom giving way to rock-cut tombs carved into cliff faces during the Middle Kingdom, and the elaborate tombs of the Valley of the Kings during the New Kingdom, when pharaohs abandoned pyramid building in favour of concealment, hoping that hidden tombs would escape the robbery that had violated every pyramid despite their mass and grandeur. A vain hope, since nearly every tomb in the Valley of the Kings was robbed in antiquity, only Tutankhamun's escaping intact, and even that tomb was entered twice in antiquity shortly after burial, items stolen and the tomb resealed, but the location forgotten before systematic looting could occur, perhaps because the tomb entrance was buried under debris from the construction of Ramesses VI's nearby tomb, or perhaps through simple luck. The Valley of the Kings itself was chosen as the royal necropolis of the New Kingdom, because of the pyramid-shaped peak of El Qurn that dominated the valley, this natural pyramid serving symbolically the function that built pyramids had served in earlier periods, and the geological character of the valley's limestone allowed deep, multi-chambered tombs to be cut with relative ease, though the rock quality varied, and some tombs show where ancient workers encountered poor stone and had to change direction or shore up passages with masonry. The artists and workers who cut and decorated these tombs lived in a special village at Deir el-Medina, a walled community that housed the families of the men who worked in the Valley of the Kings, and this village has provided extraordinary insights into the daily lives of ordinary ancient Egyptians because the inhabitants were literate and used limestone flakes called ostraca as scratch, paper for messages, accounts, receipts, love poems, laundry lists, court proceedings, and complaints. Thousands of these ostraca surviving to create an archive of remarkable intimacy. We know from these documents about workers striking when their grain rations were delayed, about domestic disputes between husbands and wives, about lawsuits over property, about magical spells to harm rivals or attract lovers, about religious devotion and personal piety. And these texts reveal people who are neither the serene, idealized figures of tomb paintings nor the oppressed masses of Marxist interpretation, but ordinary humans with the usual range of virtues, vices, ambitions, and petty concerns. People who complained about their bosses, gossiped about their neighbours, worried about money, and dealt with family drama much like people in any era. The role of women in ancient Egypt appears to have been more equitable than in most contemporary societies, with women able to own property, initiate divorce, conduct business, and even rule as pharaoh in exceptional cases, Hatshepsut being the most famous example, a woman who initially ruled as regent for her young stepson Thutmose III, but eventually assumed the full titles and regalia of kingship, appearing in official art wearing the false beard and kilt of male pharaohs, her statues and reliefs calling her with masculine titles because the Egyptian language had no word for female king, the concept nearly incomprehensible within a worldview where the pharaoh was by definition male, the incarnation of Horus. Hatshepsut's reign was prosperous and peaceful, marked by a major trading expedition to Punt depicted in her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. But after her death, Thutmose III attempted to erase her memory, her name chiselled from monuments, her statues destroyed, her accomplishments attributed to others. This damnatio memoriae perhaps motivated by the ideological problem her female kingship represented rather than personal animosity, though the motivations of people dead 3,500 years are difficult to discern with certainty. The new kingdom that Hatshepsut belonged to was Egypt's imperial age, when Egyptian armies campaigned in Syria and Palestine, establishing an empire that brought wealth pouring into Egypt, the spoils of war and regular tribute funding massive temple construction, and the temples grew enormously wealthy, eventually controlling significant portions of Egypt's agricultural land and population, the Temple of Amun at Karnak becoming virtually a state within the state, its high priest wielding power that rivaled the pharaohs, and during the Third Intermediate Period, the high priests of Amun effectively ruled southern Egypt while pharaohs controlled the north. The formal unity of the kingdom maintained through carefully orchestrated royal marriages and diplomatic fictions, but real power divided. The Karnak temple complex itself grew over centuries through the additions of successive pharaohs, each adding pylons, courts, halls and sanctuaries until the complex covered more than 200 acres. The great hypostyle hall alone containing 134 massive columns arranged in 16 rows, the central columns rising 70 feet high and 12 feet in diameter, their capitals carved to represent papyrus flowers, the entire hall originally roofed and its interior walls covered with reliefs showing the pharaoh in ritual and military scenes. The scale and grandeur of the architecture designed to overwhelm visitors and demonstrate the power of both the god Amun and his earthly representative, the pharaoh. The religious revolution attempted by Pharaoh Akhenaten in the 14th century BCE challenged this entire system, the pharaoh closing traditional temples, prescribing the worship of Amun and other gods, and establishing a new capital at Amarna, dedicated to exclusive worship of the Aten, the solar disk. This apparent monotheism, or at least henotheism, representing a radical break with Egyptian tradition, and Akhenaten's art shows equally radical departures from convention. The pharaoh depicted with elongated skull, feminine hips, and sagging belly. His wife Nefertiti and daughters shown with similarly exaggerated features. These distortions perhaps representing a new naturalism, or perhaps deliberately invoking divine androgyny. The art from this period so distinct that it can be identified immediately as Amarna style. The revolution did not survive Akhenaten's death. His successor Tutankhamun, originally named Tutankhaten, changing his name to honor Amun, abandoning Amarna, restoring the traditional cults, and the subsequent pharaohs attempted to erase Akhenaten from history, his name omitted from king lists, his monuments dismantled and used as fill in later construction, his capital abandoned to the desert where it remained largely intact beneath the sand, until excavation revealed its grid plan streets, its houses rich and poor, its administrative buildings and workshops, providing a snapshot of an Egyptian city frozen at a moment in time, most Egyptian cities being continuously occupied and thus archaeologically complex and disturbed, layer upon layer making interpretation difficult. The cities of ancient Egypt were built primarily of mud brick. This sun-dried mixture of Nile mud and straw providing adequate building material for domestic architecture in a climate where rain was rare. But these mud brick structures have not survived like the stone temples and tombs, and our understanding of Egyptian domestic architecture comes mainly from workers' villages like Deir el-Medina and Amarna, where abandonment and desert conditions preserved mud brick walls, showing houses of varying sizes clustered along narrow streets. The larger houses of officials and prosperous craftsmen, including multiple rooms arranged around courtyards with separate areas for cooking, sleeping and storage, roofs used as additional living space in warm weather, and smaller houses of ordinary workers consisting of just a few rooms opening directly onto the street. Some houses showing evidence of home workshops, where residents engaged in craft production, weaving, carpentry, pottery, and other trades that supplemented agricultural income, or provided full-time employment for specialists whose skills were in demand. The pottery itself provides crucial evidence for dating archaeological contexts and for tracking trade networks. Egyptian pottery being generally utilitarian, made from Nile silt in simple forms for everyday use, storage jars, cooking pots, plates, and cups mass-produced by specialist potters, though fine wares were also made, including the black-topped red pottery of the pre-dynastic period, its distinctive appearance created by inverting pots in the kiln's reducing atmosphere, and the blue-painted pottery of the New Kingdom decorated with floral and geometric designs, in imitation of more expensive vessels made from faience. This glazed ceramic material made from crushed quartz, mixed with natron, shaped and fired. the alkaline glaze producing brilliant blues and greens that made faience jewellery and amulets popular throughout the ancient Mediterranean. The trade in such luxury goods connected Egypt to a broader world. Egyptian objects appearing in archaeological contexts from Mesopotamia to Greece, and foreign goods appearing in Egypt. Mycenaean pottery found in Egyptian tombs, Mesopotamian cylinder seals, Aegean frescoes showing Egyptian motifs. These exchange networks creating a cosmopolitan Bronze Age world that collapsed catastrophically around 1200 BCE in a period of turmoil that saw the fall of the Hittite Empire, the destruction of Mycenaean palatial civilization, the abandonment of major cities across the eastern Mediterranean, and invasions by the mysterious sea peoples whose origins and identity remain debated. Egypt survived this Bronze Age collapse but was weakened, the new kingdom giving way to the Third Intermediate Period characterized by political fragmentation and declining international prestige. Libya and Nubia both asserting power over Egyptian territory, and iron technology slowly replacing bronze as it diffused from Anatolia, where the Hittites had monopolized its production. Though Egypt was relatively slow to adopt iron, perhaps because its copper sources in Sinai remained accessible, while many other regions faced copper shortages that made iron attractive despite its initially inferior qualities. The eventual transition to iron tools improved agricultural productivity through better ploughs and other implements. But Egypt's fundamental agricultural system based on basin irrigation of the Nile floodplain changed little, the traditional methods proving remarkably sustainable over thousands of years. And when Greek and Roman writers described Egypt as the gift of the Nile, they were acknowledging what Egyptians had always known, that their entire civilization depended on the river and the fertility it provided, without which the narrow green valley would be merely an extension of the surrounding desert.